Well, as Carole said, first of all, can you hear me all the way to the back? So as Carole said, my name's Larry Roeder. This is Nathan Bailey. We're part of an organization called the Edwin Washington Society. It's named after the first black youth that we're aware of who wanted to get an education while keeping his job during Reconstruction. You know, during Reconstruction, race relations were terrible in Loudoun County. You could probably still smell the embers from the Civil War. The kid was a waiter, Edwin Washington, in a hotel in Leesburg, right by the courthouse. And he could have lost his job. He was the breadwinner in the family, other than his older brother who worked in the field, and that was the lowest paying job you could get. The mother didn't work, the father was absent. There were two other siblings, too young to go to school. He could have lost his job, but he convinced the folks who owned the hotel that if he could learn to read and write and add and subtract, he could be a better waiter. You know, if you add and subtract, you're not going to get cheated on your change. And if you could read, you can explain the menu. Now, how did I find out about him? It actually wasn't through the some 40,000 records my organization goes through. It was thanks to the Quaker community of Loudoun County. The Quakers taught the blacks they are U.S. citizens, that they have rights to equality and have the right to approach their government for redress of grievances. And Swarthmore University, Quaker community, at their request, contacted me because they knew about the research and said, you might like to know about this gentleman named Edwin Washington that we wrote about during segregation, his zeal for education. We didn't want to name the project just the history of black education. That's kind of dry, even though it's not a dry subject. We wanted to have a person behind it, man or woman, and here we had this hero. We don't know what he looks like. We'll show a drawing of him in a few minutes. But this whole story that I'm going to tell you about tonight is not dry history. It is a story of an heroic people, a determined people, to exercise their rights as American citizens. It's unfortunately a story which must continue on with them and other groups of color and minorities as well. Something about the authors and our team. Nathan Bailey over here is one of our top volunteers who is our specialist in transportation. Transportation is one of the key elements of education, is it not? How do you get to school? So Nathan has made it his mission to understand what happened in transportation. That is fed into the book. He has done videos on YouTube where you can learn about how somebody went to a particular school. You can see the school behind him and learn both white and black schools how they went. Now, my co-author could not be here today because he's having spinal surgery. So Barry and I have known each other over 40 years. We went to graduate school together. He is a senior official at CIA. I work for the State Department, but we collaborated a lot on projects. And his role was to look at my writing. So I've written a number of books, but the thought is that we had, again, 40,000 some documents, not pieces of paper, but documents. So that's a lot more than 40,000 pieces of paper that have been lost in a 19th century two-story structure without air conditioning, without anything other than bugs walking around. These papers survived. And you know, when you do intelligence work and do a memo to the director of CIA, he would look at that memo and all the intelligence that went into it for contradictions, inconsistencies. He would analyze the analysis. So I said to him, Barry, that's what you're going to do for me because the American public will be the director. I'm gathering all this intelligence together, if you will. The team, it's the effort of a team. My name's on there, but really it's a whole team. Nathan, many others contributed to it. Georgetown University said they want one person to write it, but I want to emphasize that it isn't just my words on there, it's the effort of a team of sometimes up to 30 volunteers. A little bit about myself. I gave a lecture on this. I lecture this around the country, actually, pretty regularly. But I gave a lecture to a bunch of fourth graders in this a little over a year ago, a room this size packed with fourth graders. And this one kid raises his hand and he says, Mr. Roeder. I said, yes, stand up. He says, Mr. Roeder, that's really interesting, but you're white. And why is a white person doing black history. I'm in charge of this project. And I thought that's a very adult question. It is very pertinent to why we're here tonight as well. So I want to tell you a quick story about myself because it speaks to why I do this, but I think to a larger sense why everybody in the project does what they do. I'll take you back in time to when I was about 8 years old, living in Egypt. I was born in Lebanon. My father was a diplomat. My mother was in the intelligence community. And a war broke out. So the war got out that we had to evacuate. So my mother and I were in a diplomatic convoy going across the desert towards Alexandria under artillery fire. By the way, this was the second time I had been in combat. I was only 8 years old. In Beirut, our apartment had been shelled. But I don't remember that very well because I was too young. I remember this conflict vividly to this day. We were getting to Alexandria. We were then transferred to buses. My bus was strafed, and the driver was shot. Continued on into the port area. The U.S. Navy was there, secured that area, and we were transported with World War II landing craft to the USS Chilton, I say U.S. in Chilton, and transported through a minefield, and we were bombed. The ship wasn't bombed, but the bombing happened around the ship. And finally, my mother and I and the others managed to get to Naples. A few weeks later, my dad flew out. He had to stay behind at the embassy to look after American interests. Dad, why are they trying to kill Mom and me? Remember, I was 8 years old. How do you explain war to an 8-year-old? Pretty pertinent question today, given what's going on around the world. Ukraine, Gaza, and so forth. What are kids thinking about when that happens to them? So, both my parents were veterans of World War II. My mother was in the intelligence community in World War II. My dad was an ambulance driver in India, in North Africa, Middle East. And he saw the carnage of bombing on civilians throughout North Africa and the Middle East, which is why he became a diplomat. He intended to be an artist or a doctor and said, be a diplomat to end war. So he said to me, and Mom agreed, war was in part caused by greed. I think today is the explanation for Ukraine. That's just my personal opinion. One man's greed for another country's land. But he said, more importantly, it is often caused by a lack of understanding of other people. And this was the really deep lecture for an 8-year-old. It said it's important, if you don't understand the people across the street or across the world, they become less human. And he told me this personal story. When he was in high school in St. Louis, Missouri, his parents had passed away, and he was dating a Jewish girl. He depended for money on an anti-Semitic relative who said to him that if you continue dating that girl, no more money. So they had to break up. He hated that the rest of his life. To the day he died, he talked about that. He said, make sure you learn about other people. If you learn about other people, you find out really all pretty much the same. Maybe different practices, different food, and all that. And that, of course, is what you learn to be a diplomat. That's part of being a diplomat, learn about other people. I mean, the first lesson I had working with terrorists, which I've done, lesson number 1, get out alive. Lesson 2, make sure everything's attached. And then get your policy goals. How do you do that? You do it by showing empathy for the other folks and learning and understanding you really don't know who they are. You need to get them to review who they are. And that's what the project has been all about. I was asked while running for office to do the history of a black village called Conklin in Loudoun County and their colored school. And I knew what a colored school was. Of course, I'd been to high school and so forth. I heard the term, but I'd never been to one. Didn't know really what it was all about. And so I said, well, tell me about it. And so I asked the school system, I want to know who went to that school, who taught at that school, what did they learn, and what was life like? What did they eat? Things like that. What games did they play? All that kind of stuff. Was there a white school nearby? There was one on Gun Springs Road just a few miles away. Same question. So they kept feeding me this stuff, and I did this study, which was done at the request of a black church. It sort of adopted me. And it had been founded by the formerly enslaved, and they decided they wanted me to do their history. Can you imagine asking a white guy who they barely knew, to do their history. And I went to the Black History Committee in Loudoun County and said, "Are you okay with this?" And they said, "No, this is good." And I told them my story. It's about education. I know I'm not an expert on Black history. I cannot step into the shoes of the Black community. I'm a child of privilege. When I was a child, I met heads of state, generals, politicians, and so forth. I did not lead the life of a Black person in Loudoun County. So it would be wrong for me to say that I fully understand that, but I try. And that's really the lesson my dad was trying to teach me back then. And what did we learn? Well, the next part of the story is that the superintendent of Loudoun County Public Schools 10 years ago, he said, "I really love this study you did on this one schoolhouse. Now, I want you to do it for the entire county. What happened to blacks during segregation? It's the first study ever done of what happened to them during segregation within the school system. Been lots of little things, but this was the first major study." And that is a huge burden, huge responsibility. How did we do it? How did Nathan work on it? How do I work on it, and so forth? Well, of course, there's the papers, the 40,000 some papers that were lost. My job with my team is to preserve them, scan them, digitize them, analyze them. We're putting them into a database, a digital database, so the world can see. Where were the schoolhouses? I mean, a lot of them are forgotten. So we developed a digital map that will tell you where every single schoolhouse was built before 1968. In some cases, that's just a piece of land, but we have a dot on a digital map developed by a cartographer. One of our volunteers is a professional cartographer at her own expense. She did that. A woman is a professional database management person. She's building a version of Hathy Trust, if you've ever heard of that, for us. And, of course, a website. Why? Because as we went through the stories and the interviews, we learned this is wonderful people. You know, I've been around parts of the world where they're killing each other for basic rights. These people went through hell, but they did so with dignity and intelligence and democratically. We're going to talk about all these heroes in a minute, but I want to start at sort of the end now, this statue here. So I was part of a team of folks who was asked to design the restoration of Douglas High School. Douglas High School, named after Frederick Douglass, was built in 1941 at the request of the Black community. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But the point is, it come down in quality over time, was added on to, and they wanted to restore it to its former glory. And the thought was, let's put a statue in front. You know, you do public art, a lot of times the idea is, let's build a statue to some famous guy or woman who had never been inside that building. That's cool. That can be inspirational. Frederick Douglass is very inspirational, and there is statuary on him inside the building. And I made a suggestion, which was, how about a statue to the folks who brought you here? Your parents, your grandparents, and your enslaved ancestors. 2 kids going up a steep hill. That's why you're here. Not the famous people. They were part of the story. There are lots of famous lawyers, Mr. Houston and so forth. But these people, often with no education, said that our kids and our grandkids are going to get that education in order to go to college. So, and we'll see a photograph of it later on, but that is the model of the statue, which is now erected in front of Douglas High School. I invite you all to come to see it, because we decided to break the mold and honor the past, the forgotten past. The title, Dirt Don't Burn. We wanted the title of a conference I was running on segregation that showed that blacks just didn't have the resources that whites had. And this young black woman back in the 1950s was faced with this terrible situation, horrible winter, no wood nor coal, and kids are just freezing. You know, you can't learn if you're freezing, right? And she kept contacting the school system and said, I need wood, I need coal. Nothing was happening. She finally had to point the obvious out to the superintendent. You can't burn dirt. Now, she said it in a very elegant sentence. She's very well educated. And I thought, this is really brave. This is a very young woman talking to the most powerful politician in Loudoun County, the superintendent of public schools, Oscar Emmerich. She could have been fired for being rude or something like that. But she got her wood and her coal. It worked. She's a hero. And these are an example of the many heroes that we're going to hear about, and that's where the story, the title Dirt Don't Burn comes from. I met with her in 2018 when I was starting this conference on segregation as part of the research that I've been doing. And she says, well, you need a title. You loved what I said. Why don't you just call it Dirt Don't Burn? She condensed it to 3 words because I think that's really emotive. I said, that's it. And so Georgetown University heard about our story in the Washington Post. They did a front page story on the research. And they said, we want a book written about this. We've met the people you've interviewed, met your team. This is real. It's a national story. We want a good title. That's the title, Dirt Don't Burn. So, but the person who gave us that is not me. The person who gave us that is this teacher. These are some of the tools that we have developed doing our research, led to the book, but to something else. In doing this research, we've gone around Virginia and elsewhere talking about Black history. Again, I don't consider myself a true expert on it, but I'm certainly a student. And we've met communities where, for a lot of reasons, they don't have the resources to map out all the former schools or develop a database and so forth. So I said to them, okay, we have developed a digital map that shows where all the schools were before 1968. If you give us your data in a certain format, we will put it on that map for free. Let's be partners. And we have a database. That's not yet public because the state of Virginia restricts the access to certain information, but eventually we hope most of it will be, I'd say 95% of it will be public. What do I mean? I can tell you that Johnny went to the Conklin Colored School. I can tell you Johnny studied history, science, and biology, and so forth. But I cannot tell you that Johnny got an A or an F. I can't tell you that he had diphtheria. Who needs to know that anyway? But it would be nice to know how many Johnnies got it in the Black community and how many Johnnies got it in the white community. And so that's where the dividing line is, sort of classified, unclassified data, if you will, from my old days. And we have also a magazine. This magazine here has been around since the 1950s, a bunch of white information mostly. And I took it over and it said, every issue is going to have at least one article on Black history. It's also had other articles as well. We had one on Islamic history in Loudoun County, but every issue has at least one article on Black history in it. Because to my mind, in all of our minds in the project, Black history is American history and deserves to be told. So how do we do all this? So volunteers, nobody's paid anything. We work out of our own wallets, if you will. We don't take any money from the government. We're willing to accept money from the government. So if the Library of Virginia wants to make a grant, I'm not going to say no, but the money comes from us, okay? So that we have some volunteers who are working on documents. This is in an auditorium this size. If we opened all the documents from all the boxes, you would be choking right now. You had to wear a mask. We visit archaeological sites. This is the Color School in Bluemont, which is just simply a ruin. We want to document each one of those so that's not lost. And photographically document interiors of remaining structures. Look up old blueprints. This is an example of the kind of boxes we put documents in, acid-free, chemical-free documents from Gaylord, so these documents will last another 150 years. And up here, this is a good story. You see that thing right there I'm scanning? Well, that scanner cost $350,000. Why? The book is a ledger from a superintendent, Mr. Emmerich, in the early days of his administration in the 20s. And someone at some point put newsprint over the handwriting. So we knew there was history there, Black history, white history, hiring, firing, and so forth. But you can't just peel off the newsprint. You're going to lose the ink. Now, I know quite a bit about multispectral imaging. It's used for looking at mummies. Mummies are often wrapped in papyri, layers of papyri. So with multispectral imaging, you can look through each layer non-invasively, non-destructively, and know what's going on. So I wanted to find somebody who would use a multispectral imaging device to tell us what's beneath the paper. And I was being quoted like, $50,000, $60,000. It's expensive equipment. Finally, this nice lady, about your size, Carole, from New Zealand, came over to the United States to learn about American history. That's why she worked at the Library of Congress in the Office of Preservation. And she said, so you're telling me that if I used our device, I could find out about black history? I said, I don't know, it's covered, but I figure so. Let's do it. Yeah, but how much? Oh no, let's just do it. And so for 3 months, the Library of Congress did it. 3 scientists, myself and others, scanned these records, and now we have terabytes of data which had to be analyzed. But the point is, it didn't cost us anything. And that's often how we do our work, is by finding creative ways to do expensive things. And of course, interviews. That gentleman has passed away. Elderly people do. And so we didn't want to interview them while their history is still living. This book is full of interviews because they are the peer review. The book has been peer reviewed by PhDs in black history. I wrote a lot of stuff about constitutional law, but I'm not a lawyer. So we had lawyers review that. I want to assure you, everything in that book was cleared by somebody who was an expert in the field. But the real experts on what happened are the people who lived it. I said to them, make sure that we are telling your story accurately. And then this is my partner over here, Barry Harrelson, the CIA fellow. The two of us lecture all the time on this topic. And he's really regretful he can't be here today. This is Ethel Ray Stewart, the lady who gave us the term "dirt don't burn." This is actually a Washington Post photograph for the front page story they did in her just before COVID struck. And an example of people we don't want to forget. Now, she's alive today, so people know who she is. Lives out in Willisville, but a lot of people don't know these people. They've been forgotten, people who died. We're determined that they will not be forgotten. Here's some other heroes. This is Edwin Washington. So nobody knows what Edwin Washington looked like. So I went to the Black History Committee in Loudoun County, and I said, I would like to do a rendering of Mr. Washington. Let's go up from the back. Someday his grandson or great-grandson might show up, and he said, well, my father didn't look like that. That's an insult. So I said, well, let's do it from the back. So if we do that, what kind of clothing would he have worn at that time? So everything on here was recommended by a committee of folks from Loudoun County. So it was a big debate. What kind of pants, what kind of shoes, was it sandals, and so forth. That is how the black community achieved equality in Loudoun County, by looking at ideas and debating amongst them peacefully and coming up with a consensus. It's real American democracy at work. And that's just an example of how it happened. John C. Walker. Mr. Walker was a Sunday school teacher in Leesburg, and he started the very first high school program, unaccredited, on the second floor of the training center, which is this 19th century building I was referring to, where the records have been found. Now, in the 1920s, if you're a black man and you looked across the street at a white woman, you could get lynched real quick. But he was given permission to set this program up on the second floor. This gentleman, remember now, this is 1920 in a southern state, in the capital of a southern county, marched all the black teachers and the students to the center of that town in honor of education. That's real heroism. When I started this research, nobody had ever heard of him, which is a real shame, I think. We discovered him through pencil markings, very faint pencil markings on old ledgers. I said, what is this march they're going to? And after a while, we realized that the Balch Library, which is our local history library, they had old newspapers, and we were discovered this march actually took place peacefully. This is definitely a gentleman whose history must not be forgotten. Edith Harris, which is the lady who was on that photograph at the beginning of my presentation that covered the book. Edith Harris, she came to Leesburg at the request of the black community. University educated from Philadelphia, I think it's Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. Anyway, university educated, they wanted to upgrade the education that Mr. Walker was giving. It was great education, by the way, but they wanted to upgrade it. And that was what they were doing constantly. It wasn't a criticism of him. They're saying, we can keep doing better, let's keep doing better, keep doing better. The thing about Mr. Walker, when he would teach biology, if you were in a white school, The white government would have given you everything you need, beakers and so forth. Here, the black community had to give him their kitchen supplies. Now think about poor white and poor black. Which one's going to be poor in the South? We all know the answer to that, right? Now, Ms. Harris did something really interesting. She taught the kids why they are where they are. Taught them to think about, why are you segregated? What's going on here? She's talking about international law. She's talking about sectionalism, if you know American history, what that's all about. And it's very controversial, of course, to do that, but she did. And we see this time and again with the educators, how brave they were to push the envelope as much as they can, because these kids deserve equal education to what whites were getting. Janie Redwood. So back one time, all the schools were like this one over here, a one-room schoolhouse at a distance from other villages. But there you're learning all the grades in one room. And so the thought was, let's have a consolidated program where you would have one room for the fourth grade, one room for the fifth grade, and so forth, a graded school. And whites got that right away when they started that program. Blacks did not. At the request of the black community, Ms. Redwood, who was one of the educators, developed a scheme for the consolidated school program for blacks. And with the help of the countywide league of black PTAs and white friends, convinced the school board to do that. Another hero. Largely forgotten, but another hero that we don't want to forget. Gertrude Alexander. Anyone heard of a genes teacher? Well, at one time, the thought was that if you have a bunch of teachers who are, let's say, modestly or moderately educated, and give them a really good teacher to supervise them, the education will be better. This was an idea for whites. But they also want to do it for blacks. And so there was the Genes Fund, and it went by different names over time. It was a philanthropy, I should say, that paid part-time for someone like Gertrude Alexander to come into the county. The funds would come partly from the state, partly from the county, partly from the fund, and she would supervise all these other teachers. She also created a voting club, and the records for her and every other genes teacher in the United States is at Clark University. So I went down to Clark, unpublished records about Loudoun County, and it's really interesting what she would say. For example, if you wanted a black school, it's not going to be on a main street. It's going to be on a side street. That was policy. I figured that was probably true, but here we had it actually in writing from someone who lived it. Over here, Donna Croy. Donna Croy was the head of the records office when I started my research. And she had been told to get rid of all those records. They're just old records. Richmond said to do that, the Department of Education, except for the leather-bound books, I guess. Just throw them away, they're old records. She says, no, this is American history. This is local history. We need to preserve it. She fought hard for that. So I think she's another hero. She's very much alive. The whole book is replete with folks like this, but I just wanted to give you a taste for what you will find in the book. This is a tool by the black community, but given to them by the Quakers. You know from your studies of social studies that every citizen has a right to approach his government for redress of grievances. You can do it through a petition. In those days, you couldn't go to the school board unless you could vote. And it was bloody hard for a black person to get the right to vote, right? So what did they do? They got together, went from farm to farm and ending up on Sunday meeting with a piece of paper that said, we need a better teacher here, or we need a repair to this school and so forth. Here's a document that we're all going to sign, sometimes with an X, and that's going to go to the superintendent. He can't ignore that. We have these. One day I was going through these old boxes of records and I found this banker box. Please, if you are ever in charge of rare documents, do not put them in a banker box. It is the worst thing in the world, a banker box. It's a sin, a mortal sin if you're a Catholic. So put them in the boxes I talked about from Gaylord, acid-free, chemical-free boxes. Anyway, there's this red butcher paper. You know the old days when you go to a butcher shop, you get red butcher paper. This wasn't some petrified hot dog. This was a bunch of handwritten petitions by the black community of Loudoun County and the white community. I thought, my God, this is real civil rights history, where you could really see what they cared about, their priorities. That was really important to me and the team. What are their priorities? And white priorities are pretty similar as well, but it's harder for a black person in those days to get what they wanted across to the government. You know, politically, it's much more difficult. Socially, much more difficult. So we have scanned every single one of them. We have digitized each of them. We've developed a biography in each of the people who signed those documents, the people in that statute, in other words. We don't want them to be lost. We're going to produce a new book, which will have images of all those petitions, the biographies, which we're going to distribute to all the black community in Loudoun County as sort of a gift. These are just examples of what they went after, and Nathan over here is going to talk in particular about how they use petitions to improve transportation. This is really crucial. So this is Mr. Emmerich. He was the superintendent from 1917 to 1957. He was a segregationist. And in fact, if he had not been a segregationist, he would have lost his job. Let's just be honest about that. I think he was a decent man. I think he was progressive in many ways. But he was a segregationist. He did not believe in blacks and whites going to school together. He did believe in sort of a Plessy versus Ferguson idea. You know, the idea was separate and equal. But as he pointed out here in 1944, what's that, 10 years before Brown? It ain't equal. And if we don't straighten our act out, the courts are going to take it away from us. He got the inequality. So he was a segregationist. That's the bad part. But on the other hand, he was a moral man who understood there's a problem here. I don't think his solutions necessarily were great solutions, but the point is that even he understood that. As he pointed out, very clearly there has been discrimination here. Douglas is an example of the problems that the blacks had to face. This is Douglas High School. My office is on the left over here, third window on the left. It's a room, a classroom-sized room the county has given us to continue our research for free. So white community said, we need a real high school. All we had was this program on the second floor of a dilapidated 19th century building, a fire trap. You know, there's a record that one day they found a barrel of toxic chemicals under a stairwell, and if that had caught fire, everybody would have died. When I went into the building, that barrel was still there. Or at least there was a big barrel there with toxic chemicals in it. And so I've never forgotten that. I took a picture of it. It was amazing to see that there because I had read about it in complaints about the community. Anyway, I said, we need something better. And we need our own high school like the whites have, own dedicated high school building. There was some talk, let's put everybody together, you know, elementary, middle school, everybody in one room, one building. That wouldn't have worked. But then a white community said, white government said, well, we can't do that. We don't have the money and we don't have the land, so sorry, you know, next problem. And so the black community got together and with bake sales and other means and raised the money through a loan and just raising money, that small bits and pieces, you know, cupcakes and so forth, and they bought the land. And they went back to the white government and they said, look, here's the land. Build us a school. Well, the thing is, we don't own that land. So you're going to have to sell it to us for $1. They paid $4,000 for that land and had to sell it for $1. I mean, that's a real sin. But the black community said, you know, we're going to eat that because our kids deserve an education. This is just another example of how the whole community, not just the leaders, were truly leading. And so the school board relented. They got their land. They built the schoolhouse. But look here at the last line here. They built the schoolhouse, but guess what they didn't put in it? Any of the lab equipment, any of the furniture. Black community had to buy that on their own. That's what people went through in Loudoun County. So this building is a palace to civil rights, in our opinion. Another example, 1956, some of you may recognize Charles Hamilton Houston here, who our courthouse is now named after. You might not recognize the gentleman on the right of that, Edwin Cicero Brown. His grandson is on our board of directors. Mr. Brown is really interesting. At that training center, 2 stories now, many rooms, no toilet. If you wanted a toilet, you had to go to an outhouse. That's a lot of people to be flooding through the grounds for an outhouse, right? And so they said, we want a real working toilet. And the government said, sorry, no money, we can't do that. This gentleman here was born on an Indian reservation, went to an integrated high school, I think in Indiana. Then, with almost no money, they rented a secondhand Model T, a bunch of secondhand tires with his friends, played musical instruments across the country, ended up at Howard University, went through Howard University, then law school, scrubbing floors. First case, Loudoun County, threatened to go to federal court. They got their toilets, they're still there today. The building's being restored now, they're going to keep those toilets. Another hero. Mr. Houston was very much involved in getting the high school itself. But the thing is, in 1956 and elsewhere in the South, what the whites were doing is they understood that the segregation was probably going to end, so they created this idea, we'll give you a great school. All you had to do is this little thing, agree to segregation. And they said, hell no. We are Americans. We deserve to be treated equally. That was the message from the black community. We are not going to compromise our rights as U.S. citizens. And so they didn't take the deal. They wanted equality. So in conclusion of my part of the presentation, I'd like you to focus on the statue in the lower left. This is the thing you saw at the beginning. And these are some of the committee that I was on. These are alum, and some of them volunteers for our group. That's also the statue over there. And these are other volunteers. Sometimes we have 30 volunteers, sometimes a lot less, it kind of depends. And I want to mention that we are a nonprofit, not because I'm trying to hit you up for money, but we're always looking for volunteers. You could be a volunteer right here at the Library of Virginia. The Library of Virginia has all sorts of original school records right here in Richmond. You could be doing research for us right here in Richmond. You don't have to travel. I mean, I travel all over the country to do this stuff. You could be right here going down the street. I invite you to become a researcher in black history. And when I say black history, we compare white and black history. It's important to compare and contrast, not just look at one, but look at both. I think we all need to learn from each other. With that, before we go to Q's and A's, I want to go to the next part of our presentation, which is my good friend here, Nathan Bailey, who's going to talk about transportation and why that was so important and some of the things he has learned. But just before he steps up here, I forgot to say one thing. That training center, that 19th century building, one day I'm in the building, there's no electricity, there's no heat, right? I'm going around with a flashlight with someone from the school system, and I noticed a bit of color in the wall. And he says, well, pull apart that plank. This is Mrs. Carole, the lady in the photograph. And we found this. In between the outside and the inside wall, found 20 of these. Somebody has stuffed them inside the wall. That is a plan for who teaches what at different times of the day. For Douglas High School, which is the name of the high school. So I take this around to show you the kind of things you can find in your attic or what have you. We have found all sorts of artifacts, a blood-stained coffin maker's records showing for the first time how much blacks paid to have their family buried, lost in somebody's attic, stuff like that. With that, I want to turn over to Nathan, who is has a lot of experience talking about transportation in front of schools. And then we'll go to Q's and A's.
Pointer?
Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all still dry, okay? My name's Nathan Bailey. I'm one of the volunteers who contributed to Dirt Don't Burn. My focus area is transportation. Transportation in Loudoun County from 1870 to 1968. This was a period of segregation. I'm going to be using records that we discovered at the training center. I conducted a lot of interviews with people and read books and accessed things from the Voss Library, our local library there in Leesburg. This gentleman here is a former school bus driver, student school bus driver, Sterling Cook, okay? And he is pointing to a picture of, that's him when he was a school bus driver, all right? Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with a summary of transportation in Loudoun County. You'll hear me use the term LCPS, that's Loudoun County Public Schools, so just don't get confused. I'm still talking about Loudoun County. But once again, it's a segregated system between 1870, the beginning of the school system, statewide school system, and 1968. So for all that time, it was segregated. And as a result, there were inequities in when blacks had access to school buses, when they got them, and also in the number of school buses. But let me take you through a timeline here. From 1870 to the early 1900s, blacks and whites traveled the same way to get to school. They walked. With respect to that, it was equal. Everybody walked to their local school, and normally this was less than 3 miles away. Okay? And then in the early 1900s, the superintendent before Emmerich, Edmondson, decided I need to consolidate some of these one-room schoolhouses into larger schoolhouses for efficiency. And he started in the Jefferson district of Loudoun County. You don't need to know that. But as a result of that, there was a need for transportation. If your local school system, if your local schoolhouse was 3 miles away and they closed it and opened a larger one that was 5 miles away, that made it difficult for you to walk. So public school transportation started. And they first appear for white students only in the form of what's called a school hack. These are horse-drawn wagons with benches in them for the students. It's efficient, right? You put a kid on a wagon and haul him to school. Okay. Now, by 1924-25, LCPS moved from horse-drawn wagons to automobiles, to buses, sort of buses. Actually, what they were the cabins of the school of hacks, those horse-drawn carriages, mounted on a truck chassis. But it worked for a while. And you know, the evolution of the school bus just continued and got better. This is 24 in the 20s, but blacks are still walking to school, their local school. That's all they could do. They continued to walk to their local school or were transported by their parents or patrons, while LCPS provided school buses for some of the white students. Now, the first black bus driver, LCPS bus driver, was a man by the name of Will Brown, and he shows up in records in 1937, okay? So they've got one bus for blacks. Now, Loudoun's a big-ass county. You've got one bus, okay? And Mr. Brown is covering his route. Normally it went from Purcellville through Hamilton and on to Leesburg and the training center, okay? Well, but all of the rest of Loudoun, well, if you wanted to get to some of the high school classes that were being taught at the training center, maybe you could catch a ride. Maybe you could get your parent to take you, but not a lot of people had money for that. So you can see how this inequity in the number of buses starts to appear. Douglas High opens in 1941, and it's the only dedicated school building for blacks. Accredited high school classes are conducted there, and no more of the few accredited classes on the second floor of the training center. Okay, this spurred the need for more buses. Okay, you've got a high school. You've got to get kids from all over the county to this high school, and everybody knew if you can't get a high school education, you can't go on to college. Okay, the consolidation of small black schools into larger schools begins in the 40s, all right? This spurred the need for even more buses, okay, but at a slower pace. And this is apparent. I'll show you why in a little bit. Now, in 1940s, black and white student school bus drivers appear. And they're doing this through the 60s. Now, I walk to my local school. I've never heard of a junior or a senior high school person driving a bus full of kids across the county. But they did. And they deliver their kids to their schools, drive their bus to their high school, park it, and go to class. And in the afternoon, they'd leave class, get in the bus, pick up the students, and start their rounds. Anyway, black and white school bus drivers appear in the 40s. That persists until the 60s. And in the early 60s, segregation starts to end. And by 1968, integration is well underway. Blacks and whites are attending integrated schools. Blacks and whites are riding on the same buses. Now today, buses are traveling throughout the county carrying children of all races on the same bus, as it is probably throughout the United States. But throughout all this time, guess what's remained a constant? You can still walk to your local school, and they do it today, okay? If you're a quarter of a mile from school, you walk. The other day, I was at a local high school, and walk up to the front door, and there are all these bike racks, right? And it's full of bikes. I mean, they've got more bikes than they have spaces in the racks. The bikes are on the lawn, they're leaning up against a building, all of the spaces in the racks are taken. So they're also riding bikes to school now, all right? Okay. That's a summary of the transportation in Loudoun County between that era, okay? And how it went from being segregated to integrated. Okay. Now, what are some of the records that I reviewed in my research? Well, there's O.L. Emmerich's map, 1923 map, showing the schools and school districts, okay? But as Larry said, we're covering schools up through 1968, so that's kind of static, and it doesn't fit our purposes, okay? So we have, as he said, we have a digital map that has schools from back in the day to 1968. All right. I also used letters between Emmerich and the school board and the parents, okay? Budget records with line items related to transportation, books detailing the daily life of a student in Loudoun County, okay? This one, written by Janney, details white students walking to school, and in this particular case, in this particular instance, there's a passage in there that the student had to pass through an area that was heavily wooded. And when he did that alone, he would become very concerned. His imagination is running wild. He's got Indians, he's got bandits, everything in the world that can hurt, and he runs the entire length through the woods, okay? That's detailed in this book here. And that's from transportation, school transportation in the late 1800s. Let's see, school bus rosters. Up here in the corner is a school bus roster from 1935-36. These are gold. Why are they gold? Because they show the influx of black drivers and black buses, and as a matter of fact, the black schools they were carrying to throughout time, all right? So from 1935-36 through 1951-52, I have a picture of the influx of black drivers into the Loudoun County public school system, all right? Now, as it turns out, 35-36, I looked up all those names using Ancestry.com, right? They're all white. Okay, but that's right. That's what we understand, okay? And it isn't until the rosters, and there's several of them, after 35-36, that you see black drivers, okay? Petitions. Larry talked about the petitions that were found. Of the black petitions found in the training center, 18% had to do with transportation. And 13% of the white petitions had to do with transportation. Okay? There are artifacts from the Balch Library that I reviewed, past school bus route directions. I'll show you a little bit about that. Photographs, census records, school bus inventories, okay? But I wanted to show you something here real quick. I talked about the petitions, okay? Down here in the corner is a petition from the parents of the black students of Bluemont Elementary School. Now, Bluemont Colored School closed in 1932. This petition was written in 1934. In 1934, 2 years after Bluemont had closed, they were still trying to find some support from the county to get transportation. And they suggested this. There's a school teacher that teaches at the next nearest colored school, Rock Hill. She comes through Purcellville, past Bluemont, we could catch a ride with her. We don't know if this was ever honored. What we do know is from an excerpt of a report from the NAACP, 1938-39 transportation costs, is this. There's Will Brown. He's carrying students to the Leesburg Colored School, okay? Now, Will Brown started in 37, 38. That jives, right? But by then, 10 of the Bluemont students were on his bus, okay? So there's that thread going through. I also did in-person activities. I visited sites where I created some YouTube videos, and I did a lot of interviews as I could find them. As you might well imagine, my source is dying out, okay? The people that did this are my age or older, and they're moving on. But, like I said, I did site visits, and some of these sites you'll see are preserved historically. They're preserved, maintained. But as you saw, and as Larry pointed out, the Bluemont Colored School no longer exists. You go to that site, and it's an empty lot, okay? It's crumbled to dirt, just like the Bluemont Colored School. It's crumbled to dirt. And this wasn't something that only happened to black one-room schoolhouses. There are also white one-room schoolhouses that, you know, through disrepair or neglect, they're gone. Their site we have recorded, but there's no building there anymore. In some cases, the buildings have been converted to private residence. Okay. I'm going to jump to the interviews and point you to this one that I conducted with Arnold Ambers. Arnold Ambers' father, Rob Ambers, was one of the first black bus drivers. And I started to see his name on those rosters starting in the 40s, okay? But Arnold told me a story. He said before his dad had a school bus to drive, he mounted benches in the bed of a pickup truck, covered it with canvas, all right, and used that to carry students to school. Now, slide back. One of the other things that I used was publications, and in the 50th anniversary, Douglas High School anniversary, they released a publication, and in that publication, they call out Mr. Rob Ambers and Mr. Will Brown, among others, as parents and patrons who took it upon themselves to make sure black students had a way to school. They were using their own private transportation to do this. YouTube video time. I won't do this whole thing, but I wanted to just show you that this is one of the things that you can access through the website. Okay, we have a series of these transportation videos, and I'm creating more.
You can get more detailed there. But in 1871, the school system for Virginia opened. Loudoun was part of that. And students began attending school in terms of a public school system. Transportation in those days was very simple, okay? It's pretty much what everybody did. You hoofed it. Shoe leather, the old one foot in front of the other mode of transportation. In those terms, transportation was pretty much equal. Whites and blacks attended their local schools, never traveling more than a few miles from their home, but they were walking. If you were lucky, you might have the benefit of a horse or a mule, or maybe even a wagon. But remember, Loudoun was an agricultural community. So things like horses and mules were needed on the farm. They couldn't be spent. They couldn't spend their day down at the schoolhouse waiting to come home.
All right, I'm tired of listening to myself. Okay, back to the briefing. All right. Now, Larry talked to you about our digital map. This is a link that you can get to from our webpage.
On your cell phone, by the way. You can see it on your cell phone.
There's an outline of Loudoun County and location of different schools. Now, I've also, you remember me telling you about the bus route directions. I've also included some routes that buses took to get to certain schools, but these dash lines represent walking routes. All right. Here's Bluemont Colored School. And here's Rock Hill Colored School. From the map, you can select Bluemont Colored School and you'll get a page, a pop-up with some information, which will lead you to a page on the website for the school with more information. Opening and closing, physical location, petitions, PTAs, transportation. Now, in some cases, this link will lead you to a map that I'm about to show you, history and other things. You would get something like this. Now, what do you see? Here's old Bluemont. Transportation was required if I'm going to get there. Now, for 2 years, the students in Bluemont, maybe they lived up here, maybe they lived over here. You know, it was just, roads and terrain made it, well, maybe they just had to stop going to school. I talked to you about the bus routes and the walking routes. Well, here's a bus route. You can select that. The route is highlighted, and you get information about the route. This one was going to Douglas High. It's 37 and a half miles one way. This is the walking route to Round Hill Colored School, about 3 miles. So as I said, the Edwin Washington Project website continues. The work continues there with cataloging, web page updates, interactive map updates, but we encourage the participation of others, like adding other schools outside of Loudoun County and school information to the digital map. So, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Larry.
Thanks very much, Nathan. On that map that he's talking about there, so we belong to the Country School Association of America, which is an association of professors and docents for one-room schoolhouses around the country. For 25 years, they have been visiting one-room schoolhouses and never created a database. So any information about the schoolhouses that they visited are in narrative form. And I was saying to them, we've developed at our own costs, and we pay a subscription to a professional software package, the user package. Why don't we take your data and put it on here so we can compare our schools and your schools, 25 years worth of data. And they said, okay. So my cartographer is all excited about that. And they sent me giant essay. That's not going to work. So I'm going to be over the next several months converting the essay into spreadsheets. But we would like to do the same thing for communities here in Virginia. There are plenty of black communities here in Virginia who have lots of information that is not in a format that can be used for a map. But if we could get it in that format, then we can compare what happened in Henrico County and Loudoun County and so forth better than we could today. We are offering all of you to do that for you if you put it in the right format, to put it into the spreadsheet and using our software. Because we think this is we're a nonprofit. We're not here to make money. We're here to serve the public. And we think we have a better understanding what happened to whites and blacks in segregation if we use tools like this. And one last thing, we are looking for volunteers. We need medical historians to look at what happened to blacks and whites in the health area and other areas as well. And if you want to do volunteer work right here in Richmond, send me a note. Thank you very much.